Good morning. So today this video recording is going to review the beginning of chapter 2, which is defenses. Now, one thing that I'd like to emphasize before we begin is that in our criminal justice system, people or persons that are accused of a crime are considered innocent until proven guilty. And of course, it is on the prosecution to prove that the defendant is in fact guilty. And they have to do this to what is known as beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, the prosecution must prove the guilt of the defendant 100%. There cannot be any reasonable doubt in the mind of the jury, and if the jury has doubts that are considered logical and reasonable, then they cannot find the person guilty of the crime. Now, this is specifically speaking, of course, to criminal cases. Civil cases are separate. This chapter is going to review the types of defenses a person can use while they're in a court of law. They are not required to use a defense, but they have the option to. And this recording will go over how the defendant believes that their actions might be considered justified or excusable based on certain facts in the scenario. We start off today with a quote from Thomas Jefferson. "Ignorance of the law is no excuse in any country. If it were, the laws would lose their effect because it can always be pretended." Now, what is ignorance of the law? Ignorance of the law is to say that you did not know that something was a law. Now, if you did not know something was a law, according to Thomas Jefferson, you still have no right to break the law. So, for instance, if you did not know that you are not allowed to jaywalk, and you jaywalk, that is not an excuse, and you should be punished for your crime. Oh, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to kill anyone. Whoops. Ignorance of the law, or not knowing, at least in Jefferson's perspective, is not a reason to break a law. Because in his opinion, if it were allowed to be as an excuse, laws could lose their meaning. And you could always just pretend you didn't know. In your opinion, is not knowing the law an excuse to break it? Take a minute and ponder this over. This chapter, again, is going to go over defenses, specifically defenses that can be used in a court of law. So, if you find that you know someone who is going through the judicial system, who has been accused of a crime, these are some reasons why. And we're also going to talk about the different types of defenses. So there's two main types, and we will talk about those today. First and foremost, let me reiterate the fact that in our criminal justice system, you are innocent until proven guilty. The defendants do not have to prove that they are innocent. It is up to the prosecution to prove that the defendant is guilty, and there's a distinction. A defending attorney may also present an alibi for the defendant. An alibi is saying where you were during the time of a crime. So if I were to ask you, where were you Thursday at 2 o'clock? There was a robbery during that time. Well, maybe you were home with your parents. An alibi is providing the court with where you were. And of course, many times you might want to have someone to back up your alibi. Well, Jason saw me at the grocery store at 2 o'clock on Thursday. Or I have a receipt. Here's my credit card. It was used at this grocery store. Now, let me clarify something. There is a difference between being innocent and being not guilty. Innocent means you did not commit the crime. In a court of law, you are either found guilty or not guilty. You cannot be found to be innocent. Not guilty means that there's insufficient evidence to determine that you actually committed it. In other words, insufficient. There was not enough evidence to determine that you did or did not commit the crime. So there is a distinct difference between those two things. So in a court of law, you're never found to be quote unquote innocent. You are found either guilty, meaning you did it, or not guilty, meaning we can't figure it out if you did it or not. And I have up there the meme with Bill Cosby, given his recent circumstance. And it says here, a man is innocent until proven guilty. A woman is guilty until she can prove she's a victim. This is supposed to be a commentary on how some people perceive that females that accuse someone of sexual assault have to prove that they're victims. And so it's just a little commentary on our judicial system. Now, types of defenses. We're going to review today affirmative defenses. There are two types of affirmative defenses. We have justification defense and excuse defense. But before we get into those, let's first review what an affirmative defense is. If proved by the defendant, it makes the defendant not guilty of the crime. Now, we'll go into the types of affirmative defenses in just a moment, but let me clarify what that means first. The defendant does not have to prove their guilt, but if they're using one of these defenses in a courtroom, then they do have to prove how this defense applies to them. There are two types of affirmative defense that we're going to review today. The first is justification, meaning that the act was not wrong, it was justified under circumstances, and an excuse defense, that although the act was wrong, we had a good reason. Okay? Let's look at justification defenses first. Now, there are two kinds of justification defenses. Number one we have is self-defense, the right to defend yourself. And number two, we have something called necessity. And necessity, you're admitting to that you did the act, but there were circumstances that had to occur in order for that to be justified. And the book outlines three requirements for necessity. Number one, you didn't intentionally cause the circumstances around the act. Number two, you could not accomplish the act in a legal way. And number three, you thought about your options and this was the lesser evil. So the book does give an example of this. If you're looking in the textbook, it's on page 36. Okay, so here, if someone burns a patch of weeds on public land to stop a raging forest, that person might raise a defense of necessity against the charge of arson. That's the example the book gives. Let's move on. We're going to move on now to excuse defenses. Now, the book goes over several different kinds of excuse defenses. The first one is called duress. Duress means that you have a threat of violence against you. Something that's going to weigh on your judgment. And the defendants must show, one, again, this is in the textbook on page 36, one, that they were under immediate threat of serious bodily harm, and two, had a well-grounded belief that the threat would be carried out. Oh, and part three, that they had no reasonable chance to escape. Insanity is a medical condition that affects your judgment and you are consciously unaware of your actions. So if someone is perhaps bipolar or has schizophrenia, things like that. Entrapment, a crime committed because the police tricked you into it. And of course there's that cute little meme of the dog there. The next three types of excuse defenses we have is ignorance of the law. This goes back to our do now question with Thomas Jefferson. A person who is unaware of a law may escape liability. Liability is another word for responsibility for violating that law. And next is mistaken of fact. A person has committed a physical crime. So for instance, you're at a party and your girlfriend says, female friend, however you want to phrase it, says, can you go to my purse and get me my cell phone? So you go, and it just so happens that there's two purses that look exactly the same, and you accidentally go into the wrong purse and take out the cell phone. So that would be a mistaken fact. And then intoxication. Now, intoxication, there's two kinds. There's either voluntary or involuntary intoxication. Involuntary intoxication means that you would not know that you got drunk or had taken the drug. So if someone slips you a roofie into your beverage, or if someone spikes the punch bowl at a party. Now, for today's class activity, we're looking at here, whoopsies, we're going to look at which defense is valid. Now, for the first part, the first two questions, you're just looking at, of these different types of defenses that can be used in a courtroom, which one do you think is most reasonable and makes sense? The second question is asking, are any of these so ridiculous that they should never be allowed to be used? And then, of course, why or why not? Then on page 39 of the textbook, you're given several different scenarios of people that might want to try to use different defenses. Now, each defense is only going to be used once, so each one of these terms will be here once. And you can see that letter A has been already done for you. So there's that. This concludes the video for the description of pages 35 through 39 in the textbook.